So welcome to everyone to the first meeting of our 2020-2021 season. I'm expecting the entire season to be by Zoom, but who knows, we might get lucky in the spring and can meet in person. And we're very privileged that this evening's talk, our first one of the season, is by our co-founder, Bob Scott. And this is the perfect way to start our season. As you know from the emails I've sent around, in November, Asa Mittman is going to talk about global medieval maps. In December, Elaine Treharn is going to talk about St. Nicholas and medieval pilgrimage experiences. And then you've heard we're having members night in January because I couldn't turn down the opportunity to have St. Nicholas in December, sorry. And in February, Bob Neiden is going to talk to us about building and sailing Viking longboats. Welcome again to everyone who has Zoomed in to be part of Sarum Seminar, and a special welcome to Bob Scott for giving our first presentation. Thank you. It's all yours, Bob.
Thank you. You know, something I've always wanted to do is to be able to give a lecture in my pajamas. And this was an ideal opportunity to do it, but Julia wouldn't let me. So I have bedroom slippers on, but that's about all. This is a talk that Evelyn convinced me to give. And so if it flops, it's on her, and I just want you all to know that. And if you have questions or complaints, you can file them in triplicate with her. A few weeks ago, Julia and I tuned into a Commonwealth Club talk that was given by the English list, Ken Follett. And he's come out with yet another book, and he was being interviewed about it. In the course of that, of course, the interviewer said, "Tell us about Pillars of the Earth, and in particular, what inspired you to write that book?" And he answered the way I would have answered. He said, "There are two burning questions that people always seem to have about cathedrals when they visit them or read about them. The first is, how did they do it? And the second is, why did they do it?" Now, those are two questions that I tried to grapple with in my book. And I have to say that of the two, to the extent that I got a handle on either of them, I got a better handle on the first question, the how question, than I did on the why question. And one reason for that is that when you ask the how question, it's pretty clear what kind of information sources you need to consult in order to learn about them, where the materials, the workforces, how they were assembled, where they came from, the design, the finances, engineering issues, and all the rest. I make no pretense that I somehow answered all those questions. I certainly did not. But I think I made a better start on that particular question than I feel like I made on the why question. Now, and what I would say in passing is that, to me, one of the great rewards of having been part of this seminar for these many years is that so many of you have undertaken projects, given talks, done research, and so on, that has helped me to fill in the gaps in the story I was trying to construct. There's still a long ways to go, but at least I feel like I made a start. But on the why question, I feel much less sanguine. And I said that because I really came away from the project feeling like I had much less to say. You know my argument about the status competition among medieval bishops to outbuild one another. That certainly is part of the story. There's no doubt about that. no doubt that it needs to include some discussion of the social movement that competition gave rise to and so on. But what I never really thought I understood is what started it in the first place. That is, what compelled people during the medieval period to engage in monumental ecclesiastical building. Why did they want to do this? Once the first one was built, I can understand how competition got launched, but I'm trying to understand what stimulated it in the first place. Now, the reason why I am puzzled by this is because at the core of that why question lies what is, to me at least, a mystery. What accounts for the widespread apparent legitimacy of the impulse to engage in projects of monumental architectural buildings such as these? Why do human communities so readily accept the notion that they were necessary? What exactly was the source of the communal impulse that gave birth to this urgent need to erect such grand structures? And you'll recognize, of course, that the question that I'm asking isn't limited to cathedrals. It extends to other monumental building projects throughout the whole of history. The pyramids, Neolithic henge monuments like Stonehenge in Avebury and Karnak in Brittany, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, Aztec pyramids, Buddhist temples of Asia, mosques, and so on. The list goes on and on. And you find this recurrent pattern of monumental building that's being done. And what I'm trying to understand is what might lie at the root of that. Now, those are big questions. And it's pretty clear to me that to even try to answer them would require a lifetime of scholarship, which I'm not about to undertake, but more than a point, it would require the training and skills of people far better equipped than I to address them. So what I want to do is to restrict my comments to cathedral building in the medieval period and give you a sense of at least where I believe part of the answer might lie. And I want to begin with a very simple question. This is a question actually that was raised in a conversation I had with Bill Mart a long, long time ago. And the question is, why must the sacred spaces embodied in Gothic cathedrals be so overwhelmingly vast? What is it about the project that requires grandeur, artistic beauty, a powerful impression of a sense of permanence, the capacity to overwhelm, and all the other things that go with walking inside of a cathedral? I think I pretty well understand the need to create sacred space. Spaces apart from the secular world where the divine is treated as being uniquely present. But my question is, why do these spaces need to take the form that they do? I want to pick up once again on the conversation I had with Bill. He said, you know, after all, creating a sacred space is no big deal. What you could do is go to an open field and outline the footprint of a building, let's say in chalk or stone or something like that, and declare that everything inside that outline is sacred and everything on the outside is secular. And that would do it. Except we all know it wouldn't. Somehow it isn't appropriate to the project that is at hand. Let me get page, here we are. Why does it need to be a building at all? And if a building is required, what is it about the project that demands the use of materials that are so massive, so substantial, and are meant in a way to convey the impression of permanence? Why stone and marble and sturdy wooden beams instead of simple, ordinary wattle and dab, that is twigs and mud. You could build a sacred space very, very quickly and very cheaply if you made it out of twigs and mud. And you know it's not going to last through storms, but it would be very, very easy to repair it. So why doesn't that do the job? In other words, what I'm trying to understand is what exactly is the cultural work that cathedrals are created to perform that requires them to take the form that they do. Now, the usual answer that's given to that is they need to do that because they reflect a desire to honor God and build to his greater glory. And I don't have any argument with that. I understand why people say that. I don't disagree with it, but I think what we need to do is try to unpack that statement a bit to try to understand what actually lies behind it. The product disclaimer here is not giving you the whole story. When we're done with this talk, I will not have satisfactorily and completely answered the question I'm asking, but I do think it might, for me at least, it's a start. Now, to do that, I have to revert to some basic insights about humans and the human condition that are drawn from traditions in philosophy and social science that speak to the profound existential challenges we as humans face as an inherent part of our existence. And with apologies for taking you off in ether here, and you may be sitting there wondering, what in the world is he talking about? But I beg you to try to stick with me and give me a chance and see if I can't connect what I'm about to tell you to the question I'm trying to answer. When I was an undergraduate, I took a lot of courses in philosophy, in anthropology, in sociology, in cultural studies. And a lot of those courses all began with the simple declaration of what it is that sets the human species apart from other forms of animal life. And the answer that was then given is we're sentient beings. That is, we're born with the capacity to experience consciousness, the ability to be aware of being aware, the ability to evaluate the actions of others, to situate ourselves in relation to others, to reason, to imagine, to reflect, to create, to communicate complex abstract ideas through language, and so on. Now, when I was a student, that line was very firmly drawn in the sand, and it was presented as if that is what set us apart, and by implication above other forms of animal life. But recent work by all kinds of people, including animal biologists who study primate colonies, those who study cetaceans, whales and dolphins and so on, other forms of animal life, they're not really quite so confident that that line that was drawn in the sand is really entirely accurate. I think it is now accurate to say that while there's evidence of sentience in some form in other species of animals, when it comes to humans, our capacity for consciousness and self-awareness appears to be substantially more developed and advanced than other members of the animal kingdom. And what that gives us is what we most prize as human beings. It's what makes us human in the first place and what makes us rejoice about being human. Our ability to reflect, imagine, create, savor the pleasures of the arts, of music, art, literature, appreciate and develop science, to engage in spiritual activities, to live simultaneously in the past, the present, and the future. Those are the things we most value. But that capacity for sentience carries other implications. And I believe those other implications are actually relevant to the topic at hand, because sentience grants us the capacity to reflect, inquire, wonder, ask, search for meaning, and so on. And herein lies a problem. Sentience empowers us with the capacity to reflect on the very conditions of our existence, and that those conditions pose profound existential dilemmas which we need to somehow grapple with. And these dilemmas are perplexing, they're multifaceted, confronting them can prove to be a deeply unsettling matter. To illustrate what I'm trying to drive at here, let me just take two of the myriad existential challenges that sentience poses for us. For one thing, it makes us conscious of the fact that our lives come with an expiration date, that sooner or later, early on in life, we realize that that there's a time limit to our time here on Earth, that one day we will die, all of us will die. And for another, it renders us cognizant that we're living in a cosmos that is so vast and so mysterious as to defy our most determined efforts to fully comprehend and understand it. And when you take just those two things together, not everything else that might be mentioned here, the result is an existential burden that one observer, Ernest Becker, has in a wonderful book he wrote called The Denial of Death. It's a burden which he aptly terms appalling, and that's the correct word to describe it. It's an absolutely appalling burden thrust on it. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, for one thing, as sentient beings, we have the capacity to realize that we are in a cosmos that is infinite, whatever that means, and populated by matter so vast and so mysterious that it defeats our most determined efforts to fully comprehend it. I have always been fascinated by the field of astrophysics. And let me remind you of just a few facts that add substance to what I'm trying to say here. You all know what galaxies are, those systems of stars and dust and gas that are held together by gravitational attraction. And you also know what the Milky Way is. That's where we reside, in a tiny spot in a single galaxy. But when you stop to think about the Milky Way, it belies our capacity to comprehend it. It's 100,000 light years from end to end. And what that comes to in kilometers is the number 1 followed by 6 clusters of 3 zeros each. It's incomprehensible how vast that space is. And it consists, depending on whose estimate you take, in 250 billion stars, plus or minus 150 billion. I wish I would be allowed that range of error when I'm talking about things I know about. And the thing about the Milky Way is it's just one of an estimated anywhere from 100 to 140 to 200 billion other galaxies in the known universe. Now, what can that possibly mean? Well, some of you may know Bill Bryson's wonderful book, A Brief History of Just About Everything, and he devotes a chapter or two to this very topic. And he's trying to explain, he takes the figure of 140 billion galaxies, and he tries to explain, what does that mean? How could you get your mind wrapped around that? So to do that, he takes a building that I suspect many of you have certainly seen and probably visited in London, the Royal Albert Hall. Its dimensions are 85 feet wide by 220 feet long by 135 feet high. It has a seating capacity of 5,272 people. He calculates, and also room for a full philharmonic orchestra on the stage. Bryson calculates that each of the known 140 billion galaxies were the size of an ordinary garden pea. They would fill the hall right up to the very top of its dome. What in the world can that possibly mean? How can you possibly get your mind wrapped around anything like that? And to complicate matters further, the cosmic world has features that further add to its incomprehensibility. So when we look at the heavens, what we are actually seeing is not what's actually there, but what once was there millions of years ago. That's because we only learn about it through the speed of light, and it's comparatively slow relative to the dimensions of the cosmos. And so that raises the possibility that what we're looking at doesn't actually exist there anymore. It disappeared, evaporated, blew up or something long ago. It's just that we haven't gotten the news yet. And in addition, it does not come with any pre-existing ready-made system of meaning that renders it intuitively understandable or comprehensible to us. Instead, it just is. And it sits there in its state of isness. And one of the baffling facts is that it is governed by a basic law of physics that essentially guarantees that it will eventually destroy itself and simply disappear into nothingness. And I'm referring, of course, to the second law of thermodynamics, entropy, which tells us that everything in the entire universe has this overwhelming tendency to run down, degrade, wither, and eventually disappear into nothingness. Now, I wouldn't worry about that happening tonight or next week, even though the news doesn't always reassure us about that, but at least it's way, way in the distance, but it's in the cards. So this is part of what Ernest Becker has in mind when he describes the existential burden thrust on our shoulders as appalling. But now add to it an additional burden, the intractable fact of death. Sentience renders us aware of the fact that life is limited and we are all subject, so to speak, to a sell-by date or expiration date. So you know the famous quotation from René Descartes, the 17th century French philosopher who once declared famously, "I think, therefore I am." The contemporary Columbia University physicist Brian Greene, in his latest book, adds, the book is entitled Until the End of Time, and he adds, "I am, therefore I will die." This realization, however described, disguised, however repressed, however denied, is something from which none of us is immune and from which none of us can escape. The unforgiving fact of death stands as a stark reminder of something else about our existence as humans. It reminds us that by our very nature, we are in fact two quite separate beings. On the one hand, the gift of sentience allows us to experience ourselves as transcendent, the sense that somehow we are outside of and above the rest of nature, creatures that are almost godlike. But death, on the other hand, reminds us that we're hopelessly mired in nature, that we are inescapably animal-like. So the great early 19th century American philosopher William James said it best when he wrote that death stands as, quote, "the worm at the core of all of our usual springs of delight." And this leads Becker to conclude that when it comes to humans, nature has thrown caution to the wind, because nature has created an animal who has no inherently given defense against full perception of the external world. It's an animal completely open to experience, and that is why he labels our existential burden appalling. And he would go on to say that living as beings completely open to the world as it is, would be an intolerable condition that would absolutely paralyze us to act. There's a great essay that's been written by Kierkegaard, the 19th century Danish philosopher, who noted about insanity. He once observed that the problem of mental illness is not that those who suffer from it have lost contact with reality, but instead are unable to shield themselves from direct contact with it. Now, that's a kind of cute idea, and be that as it may, the point I'm trying to get to is that unless we create and develop structures of meaning that can help us to interpret what I've just described, human existence as such would be intolerable. We would be paralyzed to act. And so this dilemma gives rise to one of the most urgent needs that we as humans experience. It's the need to impose meaning and order on our world in a way that not only makes it understandable, but understandable in a way that enables us to get on with life. In other words, humans are meaning-creating animals, and we could not survive as a species without belief systems that impose order and meaning on our existence. And this is what philosophers and social scientists are talking about when they refer to the social construction of reality. It's these systems of meanings that we developed. In a real sense, that's what culture is. When anthropologists talk about cultures, what they're talking about are systems of shared meanings in which we buy into that provide us with a reassuring veil of order. It allows us to understand our world and interpret it so that we're able to live life with equanimity. And what the cultural ethos does for us is it imposes systems of meaning that allow us to cut out for ourselves an existence that becomes meaningful and manageable. It's a way of ordering our lives that gives them meaning, that imbues them with agendas, priorities, routines that enable us to get through every hour and every day and every week and every month and every year and every lifetime. It's basically this system of shared meanings that allows us to get up every morning and get on with life. And so now this brings me, of course, to religion, because religion plays an absolutely decisive role in this whole enterprise. All great religions supply for their followers comprehensive, compelling, deeply consoling accounts about the entirety of the existential challenge we as humans face, including most especially the very questions we've been addressing here about the origins and the nature of the cosmos and about the meaning of death. In other words, they speak directly to and provide reassuring answers to the appalling existential burden to which we are subject. And for its followers, it effectively neutralizes that threat in such a way as to allow us to get on with life. If you think for a moment just about Christianity, its message about creation provides an account for the beginning of time, for the origins of the universe, and God's role as the intelligence that created it. The entire book of Genesis in the Old Testament is basically a presentation of a creation narrative that basically lays that out. And it includes not just how the earth and all of its elements came into being, but also where humans came from through the story of the Garden of Eden. But in addition, Christian doctrine also speaks directly to the problem of death by offering its followers the prospect of triumph over death. It's the promise of life everlasting. Indeed, if you look at Christian teachings, its teachings cover a wide variety, of course, of topics, but a large portion of them are really devoted to talking about the afterlife, about how it's structured, who's there, how it operates, how you get into it, who are the people who are knocking at the door, so to speak, in purgatory, who are the people in limbo and how do they get there, who are the people who are rejected, what's the hierarchy of heaven. And what all of that is doing is basically making explicit a basic promise of Christianity that death can be overcome, that life on this earth is merely prelude to life eternal. Now, other religions such as Hinduism and Buddhism take on the problem of death differently, that is through the doctrine of reincarnation, but they are speaking as well to this very same existential problem. Now, this brings me, if I've got this right, one step closer to understanding one of the basic driving forces behind the urgent need to erect monumental ecclesiastical buildings such as cathedrals and other great churches. Because for the belief system that is embodied in the Christian doctrine to be plausible to its adherents and effective in doing its job of imposing convincing interpretations on the world we live in, it needs more than words. Words alone won't do it. It needs an expression that is concrete, tangible, and materialistic in form. In other words, it requires monumental architecture. For a belief system that imposes meaning on and stands against what I've called this appalling existential burden, of which the cosmos and death are but examples, it must impart in material structures the impression that it is more than equal to its task. It needs to be a material expression of these beliefs in a way that renders them more powerful than the reality which it confronts. And I'm not talking here about all of this is being made up. That's not my claim. What I'm trying to make clear is what it is that Christian doctrine is addressing and why it is such an important and compelling body of ideas for its followers. So once you see that, and you understand that those beliefs need to be embodied materially, then you begin to understand what the thinking is, what the impetus is behind cathedral building. They can't be flimsy. They can't be meager structures. They need to reflect grandeur, beauty, artistic excellence, and more. All of the features that we associate with medieval cathedrals. The cathedral's cultural work, so to speak, is to make these profound ideas in Christian doctrine manifest, to bring them to life, to make them, embody them materially and in a fashion that imbues them with the unmistakable sense of grandeur, permanence, awe, and wonder, while invoking the presence of the divine and of heaven. They are designed to challenge our assumptions about what buildings can do, why, when we enter them, do we ask ourselves, however in the world did they do this? And remember, the frequently stated objective of cathedral buildings, of the buildings that we have discovered, that the designers were attempting to create a space that would impart to those who entered it something of a foretaste of what heaven would be like, of what life after death would be like, and await them. So that's why I've come to think that the cultural work that cathedrals must do requires monumental building. It won't do to draw a line of chalk in an open field and act as if one side of it is the secular world and the other the sacred space. That simply won't do. It won't do to build it of simple, insubstantial materials like twigs and mud. The architecture demands enclosed spaces made of materials that connote the lesson of Christianity, permanency, timelessness, and so on. And it tells you why the materials that are chosen to build it are the ones that are required. And it's more than that, because once you build that building, it's not just that you build a structure, but then you fill it with artistic beauty, with colors, with stained glass, with music, with liturgy, with worshipers who are clad in colorful robes, celebrating beautiful systems of liturgy, and so on. And this act then of what I'm claiming is the role between the fear of death and the fact of death, and the way in which it's portrayed in religion helps to neutralize its tyranny, liberating consciousness from awareness of our natural nature, and then liberating creativity. And cathedrals are architectural statements of that are required in order to be able to do that cultural work. Now that's at least a beginning to an answer for the why question. And it's not hardly the whole story, but I hope that you will get some sense of why I think that what I've had to say is going to be part of the eventual story to be told. It helps us to understand the vital cultural work cathedrals are designed to perform, and takes me, I think, at least one step closer to understanding what lies behind the recurrent impulses to engage in building gigantic structures that embody, reflect, and make manifest the core tenets of religious faith. Now, one more line of argument, and then we can perhaps have a discussion. You might be curious to know why it is I started down this path. And I want to take a few minutes to tell you how it happened. Because, and I think in doing that, it may help you to understand why I place such a premium on the significance of the fact of death and its role to play in the work that cathedrals are designed to do. And to do that, I want to start not with a cathedral, not with Chartres Cathedral, but actually with Silicon Valley. There are two books I read recently that together led me to develop the ideas that I just presented. The first was published 2 years ago by an Irish journalist who is a humanist. He's got a PhD in English literature. His name is Mark O'Connell. And he is a journalist who writes for one of the major papers in Dublin. And he published a book called To Be a Machine. And it was named actually Book of the Year by the London-based Wellcome Trust, which is quite an honor because that's a very important, the largest funder of scientific research in the whole of the UK. And the second is by another science writer whose name is Chip Walter. His book is entitled Immortality. Chip actually is a regular on public radio. He appears on the PBS NewsHour and other publications. And the two of them together wrote a book about a growing movement that is rooted in Silicon Valley that O'Connell calls transhumanism. And the aim of transhumanism is to radically prolong human life. Now, when you read what the proponents of transhumanism, how they describe their mission, they use terminology that to me is rather jarring, and it may be to you as well. They talk confidently about, in their own words, defeating death. They're talking about achieving radical extensions of human life that will allow human beings to last not only hundreds, but even thousands of years. The language that they use includes terms and phrases like eradicating aging as a cause of death, rescuing humankind from the tyranny of death, gaining control over human evolution, eradicating our expiration date, living forever. These are the terms that they use. Now, you might think that I'm talking here about a bunch of outliers, but I'm not. These are very serious people some of whose names will be familiar to some of you. One of them is Ray Kurzweil, who is the director of engineering at Google. Arthur Levinson is chair of the board of Apple and also had been chair of the board of Genentech. Craig Ventnor, who oversaw the first draft of the sequencing of the human genome. Robert Harris, a world-famous leader in the field of cellular therapeutics. Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal. Larry Page, co-founder of Google, and Sergey Brin, also a co-founder of Google. And finally, Bill Maris, who's founder and the first CEO of Google, and now head of the Calico Project, which is devoted as a first step in this whole project to understanding the genetic basis of aging. The movement, though it's rooted primarily in Silicon Valley, is international in scope. There's an organization called the London Futurists that meets every month, and it's devoted to presentations about scientific work that is making the possibility of prolongation, radical prolongation of life possible. It's got its own academic journal called the Journal of Posthumanist Studies. It even includes a political party. I didn't know this, but it put up a candidate for president in 2016. He didn't win, but, well, I don't think he did. There it was. And in Italy, there is one member of the Italian parliament who is a representative of this movement. Oxford University has an institute on the future of humanity. So this is a serious enterprise. It's not something that's being perpetrated by a group of fringe actors. It's actually a movement that is underway in one form or the other that is trying to take on and defeat the problem of death. Now, and perhaps not surprisingly, membership in the movement is overwhelmingly male. Surprise, surprise. Now, how are they going about doing this? Well, a brief version of it, as I understand it, is this. The transhumanists describe the human body as a poorly designed entity based on obsolete technology, ruled by minds governed by an outmoded software system and running on a platform of flesh. It's poorly designed and we can do better. So their aim is, in now using their word, to unflesh the human body by transforming it into a cognitively enhanced pure mind using drugs and other means. So they're working away at this. And the idea is through medications and neurosurgery and other techniques, create much enhanced capacities for cognition and intelligence that exceed anything that we currently have, the average person does. And then basically scanning that content, uploading it to the cloud, and storing it there for downloading at some future date when the development of robotically engineered body parts that can replace what was originally there and they say is flawed, and simply transport the mind back into this robotically constructed entity. And that's why O'Connell calls his book To Be a Machine, because that's basically the metaphor that's being used. Now, very few of the technologies presently exist. There are all kinds of skeptics who are saying, well, you know, good luck with this, but we don't think it's ever going to happen. But meantime, enthusiasts and supporters of it are in danger of expiring before any of this technology appears. So what are they supposed to do? Well, the answer to that lies in a facility in Scottsdale, Arizona, that's owned by a company called Alcor, where when you die, you can have your body shipped there immediately and preserved cryonically in vats of liquid nitrogen, waiting to be thawed out when the technology has all been completed. Now, I can see from looking at some of your faces that there are expressions of skepticism on your mind about this enterprise. But it raises all kinds of perplexing questions. For example, if you want to be cryonically preserved up in Scottsdale, it's going to cost you $200,000 for a whole body preservation, or for $80,000 for what they term cryptopreservation. That means just your head. But it's a lot of money. And so that means that technology will only be affordable to the very wealthy. So think about that for a minute. Guess who's going to be elbowing their way right to the front of the line in order to get cryonically preserved and be with us forever? The current president will certainly want to have his say about that. Do we really want him hanging around for another several hundred years or even more? Or what happens to the person who's lived for 850 years and by then has read every book in the Stanford Library or maybe the Library of Congress, seen every play ever written, played every video game ever constructed, seen reruns of every TV show ever made? Then the question is, what would the nature of their existence be like? Wouldn't it be boring? And if it's boring, is it possible that the number one cause of death would then be suicide? Or what about more mundane matters like shopping for birthday and Christmas presents? So to take an example, say it's Cindy Ainsworth's 824th birthday, and Bob Nyden is trying to figure out what to get her. So he lands on something, gives it to her, and she opens it and says, "You jerk, you gave this exact same thing to me when I was 387. Can't you remember anything?" The list of problems goes on. And I don't want to get bogged down in those, but just mention them in passing. But the question it posed for me is of a very different order. It led me to think about how the fact and the reality of death currently impacts on how we actually experience being alive, how the reality and the inevitability of death frames the way in which we experience being human in the first place, and grants to us some of the very experiences of living that we actually most value. Much of the analysis presented in both books speaks to this very issue, admittedly speculatively, but of how the very experience of being human and the existential experience of living with the certainty of death might be transformed in a world in which people were likely to live forever. And their conclusion is that whatever that life might be like, it would be radically different from existence as we know it today. Now, if you wonder about that, just take one very simple example. Many of you I know have been at Salisbury during the period of time when Easter celebrations are taking place. These are the very foundations on which Christianity and other world religions are based. The idea of life eternal. This Easter celebration would, in essence, become irrelevant. It wouldn't have any meaning. Why would people be celebrating that when, in fact, living in this world, it would go on? And the more I thought about it, the more I came to realize that there are a multitude of different ways in which the fact of death contributes to, structures, and frames the very ways in which we experience being alive and being human, and the role it plays in bringing into being some of the things we most value and cherish. It's interesting that O'Connell and Walter, but also a philosopher, Scott Scheffler, who gave the Tannen lectures at UC Berkeley several years ago, called Death in the Afterlife, they all wonder about what life would be like in the absence of death, and they all conclude whatever it would be like, it is not anything like we now experience. All three of them, unknown to one another, speculate that it would have robbed Beethoven of his motivation to compose Ode to Joy, or it would rob philosophers of the great works that they've written, or painters who would create the masterpieces that adorn the Sistine Chapel. What about the great works of art, of music, and of literature? Would the urge to create them continue if you lived in a way where death was no longer a possibility? And of course, more to my point, and also mentioned by all three of them, what would happen to the impulse for engaging in monumental buildings like cathedrals? If death were a non-event, would humans even need to build those structures that will persist after they are gone? Now, that's sort of how I backed into this and began to see the connection between these enduring existential dilemmas that we face as humans and the impulse to want to create, to express belief systems that protect us and insulate us against the immobilizing impact of reality in ways that allow us to get on with life. If what I'm saying has anything to it, then I believe the next step is really to begin to think about how the why question I'm struggling to answer here might connect to the how question. Because I think that if there's anything to the analysis I've provided, it bleeds over into the how question in ways that allow us to begin to answer the matter of the prolonged period of building, the audacious architecture that's involved, and all the rest. Okay, I've said my bit, and it's your turn to weigh in. I welcome any thoughts or reactions you might have. And if you don't have any and want to go back to the Dodgers game, that's your right.
Bob, do you want to take a 7-minute break and then have questions, or do you want to go straight ahead?
I'd be happy to go straight ahead, but
okay.
Yeah. William.
Thank you very much. Very thought-provoking. I have always believed, I was taught somewhere, that there was an end of the world in the year 1000.
Yeah.
And it's always occurred to me that perhaps the great cathedrals arose because that didn't happen.
Yeah.
And they became a symbol of the afterlife.
Oh.
And that symbol was more designed to show what heaven might be on earth, a substantive form of it, than the Romanesque or the pre-great cathedrals of Europe. And so the why, to me, has always been locked up in that shift, because I was educated as an architect, that shift from Romanesque straight basilicas to the opening up of the afterlife in the secular form of a cathedral.
Right. I don't know enough about the intentions behind the Romanesque style. Maybe Virginia can weigh in on that. But certainly in the Gothic style, there's no doubt at all that what they were trying to do was to give people a glimpse of what they imagined heaven was like. And it's built right into the geometry of the building, the design of the building, and all the rest. A lot of things happened with the year 1000, including the invention of purgatory. But I had never thought about, I hadn't thought about the impetus this gave to cathedral building, because what you say strikes me as very plausible.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Anyone else?
Yeah, because that came after 1000.
Do you want me to comment?
Yeah,
Please.
Somebody else was talking. Was that you, Linda, or? I heard someone else talking, but.
yeah.
Well, you go ahead.
What?
Go ahead. I'll
Okay.
chime in later.
All right. Well, first of all, the year 1000 as a clear demarcation has been disputed and in many cases abandoned. And you know Carolyn Malone, and she has worked on that issue with her study on San Benigno. Second, there were many very major cathedrals before the year 1000. For example, Canterbury was a really big building, and so was Cologne. So the idea that there were only really impressive big monuments after the year 1000 is disputed by the archaeological record. One doesn't study it that much because those buildings largely don't exist except through archaeology. Third, the Romanesque style, I think, attempted to do all the things that Bob has talked about. It was powerfully built. The Gothic is flimsy in comparison.
Yeah.
And it was meant to be flimsy because it was supposed to challenge. I mean, it didn't start out that way. It got thinner and thinner and thinner. And some Gothic buildings are very powerful too. I mean, if you walk around the pier at Lincoln or something, you'll get a sense, or even Salisbury, a sense of power. So you can't make a clear distinction between Romanesque as not being interested in this idea. And I shouldn't talk that way because Romanesque is not a being. And I just made it a subject of a sentence there. And I tend to do that in my own writing and then have to sort of rewrite it to make more sense. But, you know, it's a shorthand that we do use. And I mean, if you look, you know, at Cluny, there's nothing more powerful than that. And there's nothing more heaven stretching than that. And one of my absolute top favorite buildings, Speyer, you can't get better than that. But Romanesque was in some cases related to the burgeoning power of rulers. And that's very much true of Speyer and Cluny in a different realm than the secular. And the Romanesque Cathedral of Chartres was huge too, and so on. So, I mean, I could go on with this, but I think I'll stop.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah.
There are people who are writing about the prehistoric buildings that are doing somewhat of the same thing. And we all think of Stonehenge, but there are plenty of other very large monumental buildings that are enormous. And what they all seem to be connected with is the division between life and death.
That's right.
You cross over from life to death. You meet your ancestors, you join your ancestors, and almost every Western civilization, well, I think every Western civilization and most of the Eastern ones too, have something like this going on. Even in Africa, there are plenty of monumental stone buildings that were created to connect humans between life and death and between themselves and their ancestors. So I think that's where we get this. And then the Christians just adapted it to their own circumstances as they did many other things. Yeah. Certainly Romanesque architecture was adapted directly from Rome, consciously from Roman architecture. That's why we call it Romanesque.
I have a question regarding on the construction design of cathedrals, mosques, and temples in general in relation to acoustics for chant, which is meditation, or reciting the Quran, because they call out and they need the acoustics for a large group of people. And of course the cathedrals for the gorgeous choirs. And then in Buddhist temples, they chant the Dharma, and it's like a meditative, and where everyone sits on the floor and chants. But in the great temples in Thailand and Burma, the huge temples, it resonates acoustically, and the larger the cathedral, temple, or mosque, the more intense the chant and the meditation that goes with it, and again, like going to heaven in the afterlife, and that meditative connectiveness through all three religions. And then you can think of India, some of the Hindu temples there also, with the resonation and the acoustics, and with the high ceilings and the stone and the marble.
Yeah.
I'm just a relation between all of those, and the connection between here and then the afterlife, and the chant. I don't know.
Your comment reminds me of another conversation I had with Bill Mart while we were in Salisbury. And the conversation went like this. It happened that at the time that we were going over there, Davies Concert Hall here in San Francisco was undergoing fine tuning. They built it and the acoustics inside were horrible. And so they closed it for a year and reconfigured it with acoustical engineers and so on. And I had been reading about that. And when we got to Salisbury, I got talking to Bill and I said, Bill, how does this work with a Gothic cathedral? I mean, you can't tune it in the way in which Davies Hall was being tuned. How do you do it? And he said, oh, well, he said, actually, you don't. It's that the music is written for the building. And I said, no, come on, can that be true? And he said, yeah. And he illustrated that with his singers in a very interesting way. He took a piece that had actually been written for the choirs of Salisbury, and he had his singers sing it. And that afternoon we went down to Winchester and he said, now listen to it here. And it was all wrong. It was just awful. So I'm pointing that out because it's very clear that the music is an absolutely central part of the function of the cathedral. But the way in which the music comes to be is one which is basically waiting for the building to be built, figuring out what its acoustical signature is, and on the basis of that, composing the music that will fit it. It was an amazing insight to me when he explained that.
Papa Niccolo has your hand up.
Oh, okay.
Oh, just back to another thing that Bill said, that you were talking about drawing a circle out in a field or something like that. Sort of clicked with me as you're talking about the buildings. Not necessarily a circle, but what popped into my mind is St. Bridget's Well, or any of the other small sacred spots throughout Europe, the pagan sacred spots that the church was very much at pains to either get rid of or absorb. And it always has struck me that Christianity, in part because of its very improbable base, or its basis on a highly improbable occurrence that's taken on faith, is a religion that constantly feels under threat. And that was never more so than in the Middle Ages, where they saw threats everywhere. So I don't think it's an accident that the rise of large buildings, as Virginia said, coincides with the rise of power. A sacred spring with a ring of stones around it to mark off the sacred spots is not the same thing as a big building that is built by an institution that is consolidating and maintaining its power. The other thing I was thinking about was what Meredith Lillich used to talk about, Gothic aesthetic, meaning high Gothic, with the very dark glass as being a light-controlled interior, so that if you're going into the sensory deprivation of lower light levels, You think about that, to think about walking into Chartres, even when there isn't a liturgy going on, just the murmurings in the vault.
Yeah.
Set up so the whole building is a sensory experience, but could never have been without people like bishops or abbots who could consolidate the financial structures on which their properties were based and turn them over into a building that would serve to bring people in and maintain power.
I have a question.
Yes.
Well, why were early Christian churches so small? The builders certainly had Roman technology. They knew how to build large buildings. They built large castles. They built very impressive walls. But churches just slowly got bigger over a long period of time. Why didn't they build big churches to begin with?
Right from the get-go. Actually,
How about St. Peter's? How about Hagia Sophia?
yeah,
Those were very big buildings.
they were.
They
huge.
built big when they had big congregations and lots of money.
Yeah.
They built small when they were poor.
Well, I'm thinking of Europe, say France, for example. The early churches were all tiny. And yet-
Saint Denis was not small.
Mm-mm.
Cologne was not small.
Canterbury wasn't.
I'm talking about, say, medieval France or medieval England. The churches were very small, even though they had the capability of building very large buildings. They built huge castles, large walls. Why did it take them so long to build large churches?
I go with Kathleen's opinion because Canterbury was not small. Lincoln was not small. Saint Denis was not small.
Those are later buildings.
No, I'm
No,
talking
no.
about the 5th century Merovingian church of Saint Benigna, of Saint Denis. As I say, this is all archaeological, so people don't know it very well, but they were very big buildings.
And even in Rome, the church is
Huge.
huge.
Yeah.
I had a similar question, which was, thank you, Bob. You inspired me to put up a picture of Lichfield Cathedral from the 12th century. And Steve Jobs' Infinity Loop from Silicon Valley from just a few years ago. And the thought I was asking was in the gaps that people didn't build the large buildings, because Lichfield was taken over in 600 AD.
Yeah.
And they didn't build a big building until 1200 AD. And most of Silicon Valley has a lot of wealth and power. And yet people don't build amazing buildings that fight death very often in Silicon Valley.
But look at the building right behind you I mean, that's an amazing building.
Yeah, I'm pointing at its rarity though. It's like, why, given that death is everywhere and we're all scared of it, don't people build these amazing things more often?
I actually wanted to echo something Linda was suggesting. I wonder whether the large cathedrals and in fact the churches in general are just side effects of a priestly class.
Of a what?
Of a priest class.
Uh-huh.
If you end up as that, I'm actually staring at a picture of Egyptian art right behind this monitor. They were building massive, great big structures in a similar kind of style in order to be able to. It's not clear which came first. Did the priest come first and then build the structures to justify the fact that the priesthood existed and needed support and power and help from the monarchy equivalent, or was it the other way around?
I would qualify what you're saying and call it the aristocratic class. And then you don't have either the chicken or egg.
When they align, yes, but the particular behavior of the aristocratic class to go off into the priesthood and leverage this, and I think Bob's right in the sense, death is a fearsome thing. If you can give a way of here's how you can think about it and sort of put it into a box and make it relatively easy to understand, you suddenly get people's attention. Now, the secular response to that is good. How do I exploit it? And off you go with the priestly.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. It's clear from these comments that the part of it that I haven't tried to include in what I just said has to do with the importance of power.
Right.
And what John just said really resonates with me, that that those who wish to be in power, wish to retain power, or want to get it, are going to seize on this impulse and use it as a resource to further their purposes, which they certainly did. And you see that in the description of the Gothic enterprise, that the social movement that took place. But I have not included that, or even tried to include it in what I was talking about this evening.
My first trip to the executive offices of Bank of America led me to believe that, oh, on this 40th floor, they use 2 floors. It's to humble you in the face of real power.
Yep.
So
You know,
I would like to talk about the fact that there are different parts of the cathedral. And,
Yeah.
you know, really the central of the worship service is in the choir.
mhm.
And having tested the acoustics in various parts of various cathedrals, that is generally where the best acoustics are. And, you know, then you have outside that, and you could have really a large group outside, but you could also have the smaller place for sort of the professional worshipers.
Yeah. You know, I was thinking also when you're talking about the different parts of the building and the presbytery, unless you go these days, unless you go regularly to attend services at a monastery, which I don't, we probably have a very poor understanding of what an Opus Dei based religion is, because most churches these days are congregational. But I'm also thinking of what I've heard Bill say about the elaboration of the liturgy and the inclusion of long processions, plus the idea that, isn't it that every priest has to say 1 mass a day, which means that the larger the chapter gets, the more altars you need.
You need them, that's right. Yep.
And so there are probably a whole bunch of things coming together. And the bigger the chapter, the more pilgrims you're going to have coming in. And so
the more money.
Well, there you go. The booming enterprise, you know. I mean, you could, you know, this is picture a cathedral as a 13th century Disneyland, maybe.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah. Yeah, Virginia.
I had one other thing to mention, though. I also wanted to underscore what Linda, you have said, and others, John, about the hierarchical system. But there's one thing that's really important in this argument, I think, and that is, how do you make a space sacred? What actually does it? And that's the liturgical service of the consecration of the church.
That's right.
And if you do a consecration service on your spot in the field, you have made a sacred space according to the Christian religion. I can't answer Jody's questions with various other religions because I don't know that much about it. But it's that ceremony that converts a building into a sacred space.
Yeah.
Which church? There are accounts of churches where they consecrated the pile of stones in the field. Which one was that? I'm trying to remember.
That's it. I don't know this.
Yeah.
Interesting.
This is the sociologist in me speaking now, but one of the topics that really fascinates me is what has to happen when, let's say, you have workmen who are working away at creating a high altar. What happens when that altar is transformed from ordinary materials into something that's sacred? What's the ritual that surrounds it? Who gets to make that transition? What has to happen in that transition? And it's a fascinating problem because basically, cathedrals are built out of materials that are being worked by ordinary people who are hammering away with chisels and all that sort of thing. And at a certain point, it's declared by some ritual that this is now sacred. The descriptions, David Friedman has a wonderful description of how this works in a Buddhist temple. And it's really wonderful. It really sort of takes it step by step. But I haven't ever seen a description of how this happens in the Christian faith. End of talk.
You've left us all speechless.
Yeah.
I just had one thought about the group of modern people who are trying to end death.
Yeah.
Is this sort of eugenics undone? It's instead of trying to make people perfect before they're born, you're now trying to make them perfect after they're born. Are these people?
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel I'm close to this because our junior high school has just been renamed. It's no longer David Starr Jordan because he is anathema because he was
high school.
He was a proponent of eugenics, and somebody discovered this, and now not only him, but apparently in Los Angeles County and every place else that poor David Starr Jordan is now no good anymore. So when you were talking about these people trying to make perfect people, it sounds exactly like eugenics.
Yeah, it does. It does. I don't think, from what I've read about it, Bob, I don't think they're thinking about this. I think they are so energized by the idea that they can re-engineer the human body to make it go on forever, that they aren't thinking about any of the attendant, at least I can't find it in their writings, any of the attendant issues, which I find, frankly, rather troubling.
Yeah.
But I should mention one other thing about this. Julia's father was an engineer, and at one point he came up with the idea that if you looked after an automobile properly, it should run forever. And he and Julia's mother actually wrote a book called Why Trade It In? And the idea was basically, you know that the lifespan of the average carburetor in a car is 75,000 miles. So at 75,000 miles, pull it out and put a brand new one in. And if you do that, the car should run forever. And he had a 1962 Cadillac that I don't think had an original part in it. He just kept replacing it. So when I started reading about this transhumanist movement, I thought, that's George Freeman's idea about cars now applied to humans. But that's just an historical footnote.
So I have a consequence.
Yeah.
I had typed in a chat, but I couldn't figure out how to get it sent.
Okay. Yeah.
It says, with eternal life, the mystery story could take over all literature because in mysteries, all deaths are either murder or suicide.
Wow.
It's sent. We got that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You did right.
Just a story like that car, Bob. I once worked in a restaurant where we had a soup of the day, and there was always some left from the night before, and the next night's soup was always made in the same pot as the prior night's soup. And after a year of working there, I realized that some soup was still the same soup from a year ago.
That's the same as,
Right.
I wonder you lived to tell us.
that's the French pot-à-feu.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you really do that? Because, I mean, food doesn't last that long.
If you keep it
Sure you can.
boiling, either it boils away or you eat it.
Well, it's like
It's not
these
going to
people
go bad
that
as long as it's cooking.
these people dilute medicine so much that there's no medicine left, and then they take it. This is a whole cult of medicine. And the soup is like that. You know, it decays exponentially.
Yeah.
I do have a question.
Yep.
I sort of lost the connection between the medieval and these modern high-tech people. The high-tech people seem to not think they're part of a natural order.
Yeah.
And medieval people, however much they believed in the afterlife, seem to have recognized clearly that they had a lifespan. So they were working to build something that would transcend them.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what the connection is between the two.
The reason why I mentioned it at the very end is because it raised the specter of what would happen if death, which I'm claiming is one of the driving forces behind the construction of cathedrals, what if it were eradicated? That's all.
Okay.
But it is interesting that the people who write about this, the people whose sources I cited, all raise the question speculatively about whether things like monumental building would just go by the boards, or at least monumental ecclesiastical buildings. But that's the connection. That's the only, yeah.
No, because you have the power situation.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I'm glad to see that this topic of power is on the table, because I remember well a conversation I once had with Hugh Dickinson in Salisbury about religion, and he said, you know, it's all about power. And he said, you've got to understand that to understand what's going on. And there's a lot of wisdom I'm learning in what he's saying about that.
Well, he ought to know. That's amazing to me.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, yeah. I have a question. I wonder if any of you happened to see the program last Friday, maybe, about Hagia Sophia.
Yeah.
Did any of you see it?
Yes.
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 That was really eye-opening to me, especially Bazira's paper, because it really sounded to me like what she was describing is exactly the intention, or some of the intention, of Gothic cathedrals, which came much later. And I'm not sure that connection has ever been made apparent in at least the stuff I've read. Other people may very well have obviously pointed it out, but it's quite striking.
I thought the audio study was fascinating, and it supports exactly what you were talking about, where they have studied, they built the building and discovered what kind of songs you could sing in it. And she played this audio track that perfectly matched the frequency response of the building. It had these long things because the building had such a long reverberation time that you couldn't have fast up and downs. You had these long melismas.
Yeah. I wish that in those presentations, they had given her the full hour and 15 minutes to talk, because what she has learned and what she describes, at least for the topics that are of interest to me, was much more compelling than some of the other discussions that by the other experts who were involved.
You perhaps remember that when they first opened the Bing Auditorium, they put on a concert with the parameters adjusted so that the acoustics were the same as Hagia Sophia.
Really?
No, I didn't know that.
I didn't know that.
Did you attend that, Dick?
Yes, I attended that, and you know, I couldn't really tell.
Yeah.
But you know, they've got all sorts of control over the acoustics electronically there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how they could have done that, because according to that presentation, they just recently discovered the acoustics, the exact frequency response of Hagia Sophia. You know, she showed how the reverberation at 25 cycles is about 12 seconds, and it changes. And what fascinated me is how they figured it out by putting microphones all around and popping a balloon, which apparently sends out all the frequencies.
Bob, if I may,
Yeah.
we went to that concert, and it was done with Karma, the Center for Music at Stanford.
Yeah.
And each of the singers was individually mic'd, and they had tremendous computing power, and they ran their voices through some kind of technological thing so that the delay mimicked the delay derived from the architecture. And they did discuss that exact thing that you just mentioned, Bob Knighton, about the popping the balloons. So that research had already been done by the time that concert was performed. And one of the things that came up about it was, I didn't know this, I've never been to Hagia Sophia, but apparently it's built on or over water. And they made a very compelling point about how a lot of the music and this particular, what's the Greek for the holy liturgy, I can't remember, was written for that space to evoke the wateriness. And it felt like, using the delay, it felt like waves.
Wow.
It was just like you could come out of your body, just close your eyes and feel this sort of surging and pulsing, like the building. It's like being on a train. It was truly amazing.
But Bisra has given many, many talks.
Yeah, she has.
And maybe we should invite her to come talk to us.
Oh, yes.
That would be wonderful.
And she's used to Zoom.
Yeah. She did one talk. I can't remember whether it was for this seminar or was it Medieval Matters.
It was for this seminar, but it was 10 or 15 years ago. So
It was, yeah, that's right. That's right. It would be wonderful to get her to talk. And that the similarities that she described between the intention in the design of Hagia Sophia and Gothic cathedrals was really striking to me. So there's an assignment for you, Evelyn.
I've got it.
Okay, very good.
Maybe Abbot Suger went to Istanbul.
Well, that's what I'm wondering about. Yeah, I mean, he just, he plagiarized.
Well, he got relics from there, so.
Yeah.
So early on in the evening, I threw up a quote from Percy Shelley about this theme. And in the poem, Shelley is describing the statue of a very powerful man. And he's, in his statuary, he is exemplifying all this desire for showing off political power and longevity and all of those, surmounting the finitude of our life. I have always found those Gothic cathedrals much more appealing than the massive statuary because of the communitarian effect of those. I mean, they don't just show the power, they build a community space that people go into and have shared experiences. And to me, that elevates it to a higher level.
Yeah.
A more satisfying level.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any comments about that, but if you do, I'd love to hear them.
Okay, thank you, but I don't, but I'm learning a lot from this conversation. Yeah.
It would seem to me to sum it up, I was thinking that too, because there's power that's coming down from on top, but it seems to me that medieval church building also takes advantage of another human propensity in the face of death, I'm assuming. You need to belong to something bigger than yourself.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Yeah. You know, I remember once Julie and I were in Salisbury and went into the cathedral on the afternoon before a major concert that they were doing in the cathedral that night. And they had work crews there that were setting up the chairs. And what really struck me about it was how that building imparted meaning to what those people were doing that would not be imparted if you were just setting up chairs in a lecture hall someplace. It was all part of a much bigger and much more meaningful enterprise that was about to be staged. And that, to your point about the way in which it imparts a system all the way down to the most, the smallest kind of detail, you know. The other thing I want to mention is that it turned out, this is to the point about acoustics. The reason we were drawn to the cathedral in the afternoon is that the choirs were rehearsing for the performance of Berlioz' Requiem that was going to be done that night. And we thought, oh boy, this is fantastic. So we went in and we sat in the building. We had the choice of whatever seat we wanted. And they started singing the Berlioz Requiem, and we had to leave because it was banging all over the building. It was terrible. The sound was just really so unpleasant. It wasn't music that was meant to be performed in that space. Well, Evelyn, have we exhausted this topic, or have I exhausted the audience?
Are you ready to quit for the night? I think, you know, it's all gone very well, and I appreciate your speaking to us and all these wonderful questions that have come up. And I hope everybody will be with us in November.
Well,
thank you, Evelyn.
Thank you.
I just want to thank the whole crowd for pitching in here. It's really been a very instructive conversation for me and helping me to sort my way through this morass of ideas that I've been wrestling with. So it's a very productive, from my point of view, a very productive conversation.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you,
Bob.
Bob.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Much bad. Thank you.
Good night. Good night and
Okay.
good luck.
I was going to say any time, but I don't mean that.